Migrants. You've watched the news, you've heard the boats and all the stuff, right? Migrants, it's a pretty hot button topic. In fact, it is the #1 issue that people in this country are bothered about right now. And you know what? This is a very sensitive topic, and it's one that often a lot of people talk past each other. Not everyone that has any problem with immigration is some EDL supporting racist, and not everyone who is pro-immigration just ignores all of the problems of immigration. So what we're gonna do today, right? We're gonna just actually tackle this topic. This is gonna be the video, the one I want you to play next time you're at the pub and you have a conversation with someone and they say that they want to deport all the migrants. This is the one I want you to pull out and show them. It's a bit long, but you know, you got time. Wages, crime, closing the borders. Because today we will explain how immigration is destroying the West. In brackets, not really, but the title will work by the end of the video. I swear, just watch the video. By the way, I couldn't have made this video without reading this book called How Migration Really Works. It's brilliant. I'll leave an affiliate link. It will give you some sanity on the topic of migration, much deeper than I can do in this video.
All the way back to 1855, this is unprecedented what we're going through right now. Look at this line. I'm going to bring on the last year. We've never seen that line as high as it's been recently.
If you turn the news on, right, most of the time when they talk about immigration, it's framed that it's like this unprecedented wave of migration. Record numbers, we've never seen this many people move, it's unstable. But the thing is, right, immigration isn't a new phenomenon. In fact, across the 1800s to 1900s, Europeans were the immigrants. In this period of time, 20%, so 60 million Europeans packed up their pasta and base hunter and were leaving Europe. And if we even look over the last 100 years, the actual global population that are immigrants has remained pretty stable. Between about 2.5 to about 3.5% of the global population are immigrants. However, that being said, right, what has changed is the direction of immigration.
Where are you going to stay when you come to England?
Going in a hospital.
You're going to nurse?
Yes.
Will you tell me, madam, is this your first trip to England?
Yes, this is my first trip to England.
Where do you come from?
Jamaica.
It'd be after World War II, right? So Britain's rebuilding, and we actually chose to open our borders to the Commonwealth. People from Jamaica, Nigeria, India came to live in Britain, and they would usually come and do very specific jobs in specific areas. You know, they'd work for the NHS, they would work in factories, they would work in transport, and they would come and they would bring their culture. They would completely transform areas like Brixton, Leicester, Southall. However, in this period of time, the 30 years after the war until about the 70s, the UK's foreign-born population sat around about 6%. That is compared to today's 16%. And it's really interesting, right? Because pre-70s, we literally had an open border. But despite this, and despite the very relaxed rules, immigration was relatively balanced. What I mean by that is we would take roughly 200,000 immigrants every year, but we would also lose about 200,000 British people. So it worked like a, you know, kind of like an exchange. But if we look at this graph, right, you'll see that from the 70s onwards, net migration started to grow, meaning that more people were coming into Britain than they were leaving. So you might wonder, what the hell changed?
15 or 20 years' time, the black man will have the whip hand over the white man.
I'm really rather afraid that this country might be rather swamped by people with a different culture.
With regard to the Vietnamese boat people, those who are genuine refugees, and that is determined again by the United Nations, will not be returned. Those who are illegal immigrants will be returned.
So without me rehashing the 70s period for the 100th time on this channel, the key takeaway you need to remember is the economy was tanking and politicians decided to tell everyone that it's because migrants are shit. All of life's problems, all of the chaos. You can't get a job? Migrants. Your wages aren't growing? Migrants. Crime is on the rise? Migrants. And it's these arguments that were made all the way back in the 70s that are basically the exact same arguments that are being made to this day. So what we're going to do is put on our debunk hat and let's tackle them head on. Firstly, houses. House prices have gone through the roof, right? It's no secret. And a lot of people will often point to immigration, right? They'll say that having more people here puts more pressure on houses, which boosts the price of houses and the price of rent. And you know what? They're not wrong. is true. For every 1% rise in the British population as a result of immigration, we tend to see a 1% rise in house prices. Now, people quibble this, but over the last sort of 20, 30 years since we really opened up immigration, roughly we've seen about a 15 to sort of 20% increase in house prices that can be tied to immigration. However, in that same time, house prices have risen about 300%. So there's about 280%, which is due to other things. The government, despite knowing we were going to bring more people into the country, failed continuously to build the houses that they promised. In this period of time, we just completely stopped building council houses. On top of this, housing has become a speculative asset. Also, developers are deliberately building houses very slowly. They know that by keeping the supply very low, the prices stay astronomical. So whilst immigration does put a pressure on houses, you can't pin the blame on immigration. It is the failure of the government and the greed of development firms to not build so they make more money. But that's housing. I've done a whole video on that, so I don't want to rehash it too much there. I'll link that below. And we'll move on to one of the other key arguments you will always hear. And that is, are migrants stealing your jobs? Because if they are, that's pretty mean, guys.
They are taking our money to house them, so they have no expenses. But also, Mike, they're taking jobs from British people.
Yeah, they really are.
Coming out after we left the EU, because the concern was about the free movement of people, and particularly perhaps East European workers coming here and taking jobs, as people said.
The idea that immigrants are coming and stealing jobs is based on a false assumption. That assumption being that immigrants compete with native workers for the same jobs. They don't. The whole point of immigration is to fill labour shortages. Immigrants come to the country to fill jobs that the domestic labour force either doesn't want to do or simply can't do it. We don't have enough of those types of workers. So they come here to fill labour shortages.
New rules from the Home Office mean low-skilled European workers like these Romanian builders will no longer have freedom of movement. Indeed, the chances are they wouldn't be able to come here at all. And that is causing a real headache in the industry, which is supposed to be rebuilding the housing market.
Getting skilled people from the UK, we don't find that difficult. What we find very difficult is the jobs which the British do not want to do. Nobody wants to work in the cold British weather. Nobody wants to work in freezing conditions, work outdoors. So unfortunately, that's the difficulty that we've had.
I think the clearest way to look at this is just to go on the simple logic, right? If immigrants stole jobs, then we would expect that if we see a spike in immigration, we should also see a spike in unemployment, right? Because, they've stolen the job. You're now unemployed, you got no job. But if you actually look at the data, the general trend is that immigration spikes alongside periods of high employment. There's a slight lag time, but this is generally the trend that you'll see. And that's because immigrants are going to go to a place where there's a demand for their labour and their skills. A demand that isn't currently being filled by the local domestic labour force. And that labour shortage can be a result of the fact that we may have not trained up enough people to do the job. Like in England, we don't have a lot of welders and we don't really invest a lot into our doctors. And so those industries employ from nations that did train up those workers. And bro, there is a fair critique you can make that maybe we do need a few more welders and a few less marketing execs. Sure, I'm not gonna disagree with that, but that would require the government to coordinate and invest a lot of money into that training. And for some reason, that's a big no-no. You don't train people. The other thing to note is that when an immigrant comes to a country, they're not zero-sum. They don't just take. They too also need to go and get their hair cut. They need to go and get their carpet fit, buy a third air fryer from John Lewis, right? They are also customers. So immigrants also create demand and they create jobs. But you might hear that and think, that's all well and good. But often this argument of taking jobs gets paired with another argument. Immigrants drive down wages.
The guest worker provisions in this bill, which will bring many hundreds of thousands of lower wage workers into this country, will only make a bad situation even worse. And I think at a time when the middle class is shrinking, the last thing we need is to bring over a period of years millions of people into this country who are prepared to lower wages for American workers.
So this one is a little bit more complicated, right? The astute amongst you might have noticed that recently, wages have not been growing very well. Back in the 70s, wages used to grow by about 3% a year. But by 2010, wages are basically flatlined. At one point, it was about 0.9% growth. Wages have definitely taken a hit recently, and many people will notice that in the same period of time, we've seen a major increase in immigration, particularly from the 90s onwards. And I think most of us who have some basic understanding of economics have heard the phrase Supply and demand. If you increase the supply of labor, of people who come from poorer countries, who are okay to live in poor accommodation and have lower living costs, then surely businesses will employ the migrant worker because they can pay them less. And it's a fair question, right? It's a fair question, and a load of big brain bros did a bunch of studies on this.
Very quickly before we carry on with this video, I want to give a massive shout out to today's sponsor, YFood. These bad boys are ready to drink complete meals. They have everything you need, up to 34 grams of protein, 26 different vitamins and minerals. They keep you full for 3 to 5 hours. My favourite flavours are the salted caramel, the cold brew coffee, and classic choco. There's a bit of a theme there, I kind of like that, but there is fruity flavours if you prefer that. As well, they're like gluten-free, this one's lactose-free, and no added sugar. I find them quite helpful if I'm on the go and busy and I don't get time for lunch or something. These are really efficient and very tasty ways of getting your nutrition. There's also the packets as well, which you can just put in a shaker and just keep it on the go and make it when you're at the gym or something like that. I really recommend these, like they're just genuinely very tasty beyond anything else, and they're good for you. They do both classic and vegan options of the ready to go drinks, and classic and vegan options for their bars and their powders. Definitely go check them out. They're offering a 30% off strike prices site-wide, plus a little extra 5% off just for you lot using the code JTG-YouTube. So you guys will get 35% off. Check the links below. Anyway, back to the video.
One of them found that immigration reduces wages by about 0.01 pence to 1p per hour. Other studies found something different. There was one that found that there is a minus 0.5% wage suppression on the lowest 10% of earners in society. However, the same study found that there was a neutral or even a positive effect on everyone else. However, there is a very recent study that showed that in low wage professions, they found a 1.6 to 1.9% dip in wages. It showed it in very certain sectors, so things like hospitality, cleaning, food production. It showed that in those low wage jobs, there is a small percentage squeeze on wages. And it's not nothing, and we'll talk about it, but it's important to note that the many studies that have been done on this topic have concluded that the impact on wages are small to negligible and both positive and negative, but it's just very tiny. And it's confusing because very obviously, like most people will notice, that wages have stagnated at a much higher rate than even what the highest estimation from those studies have shown us that is caused by immigration. So if it's not immigration that is suppressing wages, then what is?
Where's my fucking money? I'll get it. I'll get it. My neck, Tony.
If you want to know who has your wonga, then it's worth noting this. Between 1980 and 1989, corporate profits as a share of national income jumped from 17% to 26%. Well done, chaps. Well done. Very good, very good. Meanwhile, in the same period of time, the workers' share fell by 8%. Since 1978, CEO pay has increased by 1,300%. Woo! Go on, bros. Whilst pay for workers increased 18%. Woo! Oh, wait, what? And there is a reason for this, right? So, in the 70s, half of all UK workers were in a union. Today, the amount of people in unions has fallen to 22%. That's overall. Like if we go into the private sector, it's about 12.8%. So you probably kind of know this story, but as Thatcher went in and declared war on the unions, calling them like the enemy from within, her government introduced law after law to basically break the power of unions.
You'll find that there are more powers to unions here than there are anywhere else in the world. And that really hasn't made a position of free collective bargaining, because you can really only be free if the two sides are fairly evenly balanced.
So back then you would have things like wage councils. So if you had a low-paying job, things like agriculture, these wage councils demanded a certain wage for all workers, but these were abolished. Now, if you work a low-paid job, they can just pay you a handshake and a sandwich. On top of this, solidarity strikes were banned. So if you wanted to strike with someone from a different industry, you couldn't legally do that anymore. As well, mandatory union membership, which was in certain industries in the past, that too was banned. So all of this, right, this union crushing, coupled with the process of deindustrialization, where in the past, in the 50s, 4 out of 10 workers worked in manufacturing, in steel, in coal, in shipbuilding. These were stable, unionized, and well-paying jobs for the average working class person. However, by the 2010s, after this deindustrialization process, just 8% of workers are now in manufacturing. Entire towns were completely wiped out after this and have gone into steep decline. And those old, well-paying jobs were replaced with like shitty jobs in call centers, Amazon warehouses, gig economy jobs, zero-hour contracts, no pensions. And it is the destruction of unions and collective bargaining that made it possible for big businesses to exploit cheap migrant labor. So I want to go into this because this argument is one of the most compelling about immigration, as there's kernels of truth to it. In this country, it is possible for companies to pay dog shit wages, and if their workers accept them or they don't, it doesn't really matter, because successive governments have allowed these big businesses to recruit overseas, handing out work visas to people that will take these terrible wages. Now I know what you're thinking, right? You're hearing this and you're going, hang on a second, Jimmy. I thought you just said that immigration doesn't suppress wages. And like, yeah, sort of, kind of, but like, just think about it like this. If you get punched in the face and your jaw breaks, you don't blame your jaw, right? You don't blame your jaw for breaking. You blame the guy for punching you in the face. He's to blame, right? Immigration isn't the problem. It isn't the reason for wage suppression. The problem is the lack of worker protections and the incredible control and power of corporate lobbyists who have complete control over the government. They push the government and allow them to exploit migrant labor forces and bring them to fill these jobs that are just so bad, so low paid, and in such terrible conditions that the native working population simply don't want to do them. And so migrants will come and fill those positions.
Well, few would dispute that a big global economy like Britain's should strive to attract highly skilled workers from around the world. So a bigger question may be this: if we curtail the number of lower skilled workers coming into the country, will there be enough Brits to fill the gaps?
You might be thinking to yourself, well, why don't we just stop the immigration? If we stop the immigration, then surely the natives will be able to argue for better wages and then they will take the jobs, right? Right? So I'm going to answer that question with a personal anecdote. So like, I'm an average bro, right? An average sort of lower middle class kid. I personally spent one shift in an Amazon warehouse and I was fired by the end of the day because I couldn't take it. Now, is that because I'm a soft pussy? Yes, partly. But it is also because I had options. Instead of working a grueling job in a warehouse where I wasn't even allowed to fucking look people in the eye or even listen to music, I instead stayed at my parents'. I stayed at home and I took a part-time job. One that didn't pay me so much, but it was much more enjoyable, and it was working outdoors in some activity centre place. And I was doing that job whilst on the side working on my own businesses, which eventually ended up as being YouTube. Now I know this is just an anecdote, but this is a reflection of a broader trend. A trend that you'll see in the young British labour force. Lots of people who are my age, we grew up and many of them were told to go to university, go get a degree, expecting to come out and just walk into a job as an accountant or working in marketing or some job that takes you like 30 minutes to explain to people because you don't really know what you do, but you get paid for it anyway. As well, that's just one of the changes. Another one was that since the 70s, women have entered the workforce. Historically, women spent most of their time at home raising children, but also doing unpaid and informal labor, as in many cases they were pretty much locked out of the job market. So, you know, they spent their time raising children. That is a full-time job. It's very hard. Whilst they were doing that, they might have also been looking after elderly family members. And maybe on top of that, even did like a side job as a cleaner. Maybe they worked in like a textile factory or some sort of small job that wasn't paid very well, but they'd make a few quid on the side. You see, as women's rights progressed, they started to enter the labor force. They started to aspire for bigger, higher skilled professions. But this meant that they had less time to do all of that unpaid work that they were doing in the past, which created a massive labor demand for these jobs that women were doing in the past that were vital, but no one really wants to do them because the ladies were doing for free. And so on top of these changes in education and expectations, there was another fucking spanner that was thrown in the works, and that was old people.
World is getting older. How much older? By 2050, the number of people over 65 will triple.
There are now more over 65s than ever before, 18.6%. In England, the places with the most over 65s are here in North Norfolk and Rother in East Sussex.
Basically, the old people, they were top shaggers, right? They had a lot of kids. Them baby boomers, it's in the name, you know, them bros are getting freaky. Every single generation, right, as life has got more expensive and more demand for people's time in work, etc., every single generation seems to have less and less kids. This has resulted in a plummeting birth rate. Back in the 70s, women were having about 2.5 kids on average. Now in 2023, it's about 1.56. So in the 70s, the ratio of working age people to old people was much different. There was around about 4.3 workers per every pensioner. Now it's dropped down to 3 workers. And is expected to drop down even lower to just 2.1 by 2050. And this is a problem, right? Because to afford their sort of end of life care, it gets more and more expensive. They become more, they're not working anymore and they're claiming a state pension. They use the NHS more. And so we are currently having a very top heavy society of old, economically inactive people and a shrinking worker force. There just mathematically isn't enough people to cover the costs of pensioners. And so this has created major labor shortages. And you know what that means? Migrants. So over time, there's been a growing demand of what can be called low skill, low wage jobs, which is basically a Tory word for really fucking hard jobs that they wouldn't last 5 minutes doing and are completely vital to keep our economy going, but we decide to pay them like shit. These jobs, whilst vital, as I explained, the native workers just don't really want to do them. Do you want to clean a hotel for £9.50 an hour? Do you want to wipe an old person's ass? Or do you want to restrain a mentally unstable patient who's attacking other residents in a care home? All for £10 an hour on a 0-hour contract with no pension. Most native workers will say no. Why would I take that job when I have the legal right to claim out of work benefits? Maybe you do that, or if you're fortunate enough to afford to stay at home with your parents, maybe you do that whilst working some part-time job in a bar, all whilst you wait for a better, more stable, higher paying job. This safety net that us as native workers have gives us the flexibility to not have to take these terrible jobs and wait patiently for something better to come along. And that is great, right? That's good that we don't have to do that, but those jobs still need doing.
In UK, young generation, they are not interested on low skill work. There is huge opportunity for our next generation who's studying here, school, university. They can be high skill. But we are short of low-skill worker.
But very luckily for these big businesses, there is a whole class of people that don't have that luxury, that don't have those rights, who have so few rights, in fact, that if they ask you for a pay rise, you can just kick them out the country. And it's this type of immigration, right? This sort of low-skill, low-wage immigration that, to be honest, most people I speak to seem to have a problem with. And I want to say, right, I too have a problem with this type of immigration. I think it's very exploitative. I don't think you're a bad person if you look at that and you think it's immoral. To have a class of people with literally less human rights than you have, who we treat worse than everyone else, all because they will accept low pay and worse working conditions. Although, and this is where I'll differ to lots of people, is who is at fault and what is the solution to it? The best way to answer that is if we just look around the world, right, at nations that seem to have more and less low skill, low wage immigration. If we look at Britain and America and Dubai, my God, Dubai, Jesus, these people, they don't give a fuck. The general trend that I have noticed is in nations that have lower rates of unionization, lower worker protections, but are wealthy and more developed, you tend to notice high rates of low skill, low wage immigration. Whereas, if we contrast this, right, with nations that have really high worker protections, really high rates of unionization, strong human rights, and who are wealthy, those nations, they tend to have lower rates of low skill, low wage immigration. Norway's union density is around about 50%. That's a lot, that's incredibly high. And there's strong enforcement of equal treatment laws. It would be very hard for you over there to underpay a foreign worker and just hope that no one notices that you're doing that. Because over there, unions are active and enforcement is real. And as a result, Norway sees less low wage immigration. And they generally have less public anger about migrants taking jobs because they can't. Finland, Denmark, they're similar. Strong unions, strong worker protections, tight enforcement. And in these nations, migrants can and do come. But very importantly, they're not allowed to become an exploited underclass of society. And so this leads me to this conclusion that to many might seem counterintuitive. However, if you give migrants the same rights as native workers, all the same access to the welfare state, the same ability to claim unfair dismissal, same pay as union workers, if you treat migrants like humans and respect their human rights, you will actually see less low-wage jobs that need an exploitable migrant labor force, as the wages in those low-skilled jobs will be high enough to attract native workers. And like this solution, this isn't what you're going to hear, right? It runs counter to the popular solution, the one that we hear the most, which is shut the borders. This is all we hear all the time, you know, stricter, harsher, make visas tougher, put a massive wall with alligators and spikes. We hear this solution all the fucking time. And the question is, does it even work?
A new study by Durham University has found Boris Johnson's Brexit deal, the deal also championed by Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, is the primary factor in the crisis of small boat crossings in the English Channel. That's right, the government has yet again inflicted a problem on itself.
Look, I know I'm going to sound like a super woke lib right here, I get it, but this is just literally a fact. And I know this fact might annoy lots of people, but the truth is, restricting immigration increases immigration. I know it sounds backwards, but just hear me out. I mean, think about it. Britain, we left the EU pretty much so that we could reduce immigration. And it was at the time, it was something about like, I don't know, Polish people back then. Obviously, it's moved since that. And what happened? Well, we went from having sort of back and forth immigration with the EU. We put the walls up, you know, we said, no more migrants. And then somehow migrants just skyrocketed. What the fuck? How the hell did that happen? Like, surely, right? If you make the rules harsher, if you put up barriers, walls, and checks, got point-based system, surely immigration will go down, right? I don't want to be the guy to break this to you, but it just doesn't. As I mentioned earlier, right, in the post-war period, when we literally had an open border to the Commonwealth, we were operating what was called a circular migration model. Migrants would come over here for a few years, and they would work in specific industries, they would save up some money, and then typically, they would go home. For many of those migrants, coming to Britain wasn't a permanent thing. It was a work opportunity. And like, I keep harboring on about this, but this is a period of time where we had the most open borders possible, with nations that were very poor and had lots of reasons to go to a wealthy nation and stay there if that's what they wanted to do. However, net migration rates, the percentage of like permanent foreign-born citizens in Britain was only about 6%. However, in the 70s, as we had this sort of anti-immigrant backlash, politicians started imposing stricter rules on migrants. Visas had tighter conditions. There was limits on bringing your family over. And what they did was make it more expensive and riskier to come and go. And it meant that instead of people just returning home, many of them would instead panic and rush to go and get citizenship. And, you know, because of all these rules, these citizenship applications required that you had to stay here for a period of time. So ironically, it forced people into permanency in order for them not to lose their rights to free movement, to come and go. And this process hasn't just been seen in Britain, this has been seen all around the world repeatedly. Spain in the 80s and 90s would have a common thing of Moroccan workers coming over seasonally, mainly doing like agricultural work. They would come, do the work and then leave, go back to Morocco. However, in 1991, pressured by the EU, Spain restricted and made it illegal for Moroccans just to come and go as they pleased. And so Moroccans didn't stop coming. They instead started to put roots down in Spain. They became more permanent. They brought their families over and they made permanent Moroccan communities in Spain. And so the Moroccan community that was in Spain was about 59,000 people. It jumped all the way up to 400,000 people by 2005 as people scrambled to get residency. And the same thing happened in America when they ended the Bracero program and it made all of the Mexican migrants that used to come back and forth, it made them permanent.
The Bracero program, established by the U.S. and Mexican governments in 1942, allowed Mexican nationals to legally enter the U.S. for up to 6 months to work as contract laborers, mainly on farms.
Mexican men would register to come across the border to work for a specific time period to do this sort of picking work.
Bracero means farmhand in Spanish. The program merely legalized a migration that had been going on for some time.
Because think about it, if you've put all that effort to get into the country, some of which would have come illegally, not all of them, but if you've gone to that effort and you know that if you leave, you're not coming back, you're not going to risk going home. You're going to stay put. And like, you got to bear in mind, right, this talk of immigration that we hear now about restricting immigration, it is not new. Every single fucking politician since Thatcher has said that they're going to clamp down and reduce immigration. Honestly, just fucking Google it. They all say it. They continuously all say it. And they do. They bring in all these schemes and they do bring all these restrictions. Since the 2000s, visas into Britain have got harder and harder to get. They're increasingly complicated, increasingly expensive, especially if you're not from the EU. Like, spousal visas now cost thousands. Work visas now have no access to the welfare state, and you have to pay $1,000 a year to use the NHS. And there's now income thresholds on lower paid immigration that means that they can't bring their families over unless they earn much higher salaries. But in spite of all of these restrictions, immigration didn't ever go down. And that is because the jobs that these migrants were coming to do in the first place still needed doing. I don't know if you'll remember this, but after Brexit, right, where we tried to get rid of the migrants, but a lot of them were coming to like pick fruit in the summer, we ran this scheme called Pick for Britain, where we tried to get native workers to go and pick fruit.
I do not doubt that the work will be unglamorous and at times challenging, but it is of the utmost importance, and at the height of this global pandemic, you will be making a vital contribution to the national effort. So I can only urge you to pick for Britain. About
fucking 10% of the jobs got filled and most people just left after a day because it's back-breaking hard work for shit money. It resulted in UK farms losing £22 million worth of fruit literally because they had a lack of people picking them. And it's this, right? It's this just economic fact, this need for labour, which is why every single politician that ever comes in and tells you they're gonna reduce immigration, it's this that is why they can never do it. Like, think about it, Giorgia Meloni, she basically flip-flopped on her immigration policy and now people don't like her anymore. And she was a very extreme anti-immigration person. Do you think she randomly just fell in love with migrants, or do you think that she realized it can't be done? Trump himself has actually also softened his stance on immigrant labor.
On immigration, what made you change your mind?
Our farmers are being hurt badly by, you know, they have very good workers. They've worked for them for 20 years. They're not citizens, but they've turned out to be, you know, great. And we're going to have to do something about that. We can't take farmers and take all their people and send them back because they don't have maybe what they're supposed to have, maybe not. And you know what's going to happen and what is happening? They get rid of some of the people because, you know, you go into a farm and you look and people they've been there for 20, 25 years and they've worked great and the owner of the farm loves them and everything else, and then you're supposed to throw them out, and you know what happens? They end up hiring the people, the criminals that have come in, the murderers from prisons and everything else. So we're going to have an order on that pretty soon, I think. We can't do that to our farmers, and leisure too, hotels. We're going to have to use a lot of common sense on that.
Even when he was doing these massive clampdowns, and he did for a period of time reduce some immigration, studies show that it basically had no increase in wages. And the reason why they can't do anything about it is because these politicians are tied to neoliberal economics. Their form of capitalism requires cheap, exploitable labor. And their big donors and the big corporations that fund these politicians will never allow them to just simply reduce immigration. They need that labor force. And like, look, me on a personal level, I'll be honest, I quite like immigration. I'm fine with it personally. But for the people that are against it, they are in a bind because in order to actually reduce immigration, you would need to raise worker protections, increase unionization, and tax rich people to afford the welfare state. And the anti-immigration politicians are against doing all of those three things. And so with all that being said, right, with this economic reality, that these politicians who tell you they're going to reduce immigration, they know they can't do it. This is why they shift the goalposts. In order to divert your attention away from reducing immigration in any meaningful way, these politicians will do these theatrical stunts, like Trump doing all these raids on Home Depots, etc., sending migrants to El Salvador, and here in Britain, our politicians banging on about the boats and the boat crosser, the boat people. All they are doing is a political song and dance to make you focus on a new boogeyman, which is illegal immigrants. Dun, dun, dun. Now, I've talked about illegal immigration before, but we'll go over it a little bit again here because this is really important, because illegal immigrants kind of work as like an ideological propaganda. Because in reality, illegal immigrants make up an incredibly small subsection of society. There's around about 900,000 to 1.2 million in the UK, obviously spread all across the UK. They make up about 1 to 2% of our population. But they kind of work as a way of taking people's general fears and concerns about immigration as a whole, and they become like the totem pole that you can just fucking beat. And often, to be honest, when I speak to people who are kind of like anti-immigration or whatever, the thing that I often hear is them saying the phrase, I don't actually mind immigrants, I just don't like the illegal ones. And this bears out, this sort of opinion, you can kind of see it roughly in polling data. At the time of recording right now, immigration is Britain's #1 concern. If you poll people, it's the top issue you'll hear back about. It didn't used to be, you know, we can probably point to a few people as to why this is, but yeah, it is the issue that's on people's minds at the moment. If you ask British people, is immigration too high? 73% of Brits will say yes. However, right, before you think we're all racists, etc., if you slightly tweak the wording of that question and you say, has immigration been an overall positive to Britain? About 65-ish% of people will answer either yes, it's a positive, I don't know, or they're just neutral about immigration. The overwhelming majority of people are not fundamentally opposed to immigration. They're concerned that the numbers are too high. And this is interesting because there is an actual nuance in the attitudes of the general population, a nuance which is completely lost on politicians. And I do think a lot of it can be associated with this whole illegal immigration thing. This perception that people are sneaking into the country illegally and they're breaking a law by coming in, like this idea that these are all criminals. How many people do you want whose first act of coming into the country was to break a law? You hear that one a lot. And these talking points are often generated by the media, and they're quite clever because they often muddy the waters when it comes to the difference between legal immigrants, illegal immigrants, and refugees.
That we have a safe and legal route that is potentially open to millions and millions and millions and millions of people.
You see, because that's the scare story we get, right? It's like either people... No, please.
Go on.
This is how it's always presented. It's either hundreds of millions of people, the entire world, everybody comes here, or what we have now. And that's actually not the real choice.
No, it's not.
Yeah, well, I mean, technically, territorial asylum is theoretically open to hundreds of millions of people. The fact of the matter is 25,000 people have come this year. That is a drop in the ocean. You and I both know that, don't we? We know that that is a tiny proportion.
Absolutely.
Even of immigration.
Yeah, I'm not disagreeing to all I'm saying.
So, I want to make a few things clear. Firstly, boat crossings, which gets a disproportionate amount of media coverage, most of them, the people coming over on boats are overwhelmingly legitimate refugees. 70 to 75% of people who apply for refugee status are deemed to be genuine. These tests are very rigorous. They're tested on accents, knowledge of the local language, local dialects, local currencies, knowing about the politicians, the story of the war that's happening in your country, all these things that are relatively hard to fake. Like, let's pretend I'm the border guard as a Brit, an American comes in and he tries to pretend to me that he is a Brit. Oh, hello, mate. Harry Potter on Tuesday, innit? Fuck off, mate. I'm going to fucking suss him out pretty quickly, right? Now, bear in mind, of all immigration, boat crossings are about like 3% of all immigration. It's a very small amount. And the idea that they're breaking the law is not true. They've not broken a law under UN human rights, which was agreed after World War II because, you know, like the Jews and that. Every human, yourself included, should you ever need it, and the way things are going, you might need it, has a right to seek refuge in other countries. This is a good thing. Like, imagine us YouTubers took over the country and we start persecuting TikTokers. The TikTokers can go to France. It's nice over there. It's going to be perfect for your TikToks. And speaking about France, often people will say, well, hang on, if they're real refugees, why don't they stay in France? France is safe. And this is true. However, France already takes 50% more refugees than we do, and they have a massive backlog, long waiting times to get your refugee application processed. And they too also have a big anti-refugee thing going on, so they're trying to reduce their numbers. So many refugees in France are forced to live on the streets, or for a period of time, they were living in a camp in Calais. And so, yeah, they might want to not live on the street, so some of them try and come to Britain. But that in and of itself, that misses a whole entire other point, which is that refugees typically go to nations that they have some kind of historic tie to, some connection to. Think about it. Why do you think that different places in Europe have different populations of refugees? Like, why do you think in Britain we don't hear a lot about Congo or Ivory Coast refugees, but in France they have loads of them? It's because of colonial history. Places where people are leaving have connections to us, either via language or family ties. And so often they will go to places where there's communities of people similar to them from the same background, because it gives them a bigger opportunity at assimilating into the culture, getting a job, and, you know, just being a fucking normal human. And the other one I'll just touch on, right? The other argument you hear about refugees is that it's all young military age men. You hear that a lot.
You know, over 80% of those that come are young men between the ages of 18 and 26 who've deserted their families in Pakistan, Eritrea, Sudan. I mean, you name it.
And it's true. It is disproportionately young men. And why do you think that is? Well, because that journey is pretty fucking dangerous, right? If you're a refugee from Sudan, which is the least developed country on earth, you are very poor. It is very expensive to get from Sudan to Britain, so most of them will never come this far. 73% of refugees just stay in the developing world. So what sometimes happens is a family will pull all of their money together to send one person to try and get to the Western world where it's safer and they have more opportunities. So you send your young male, and when he gets to the country, he hopefully gets his refugee status approved, and then he can bring his wife and children, etc. over using the family reunification scheme. And we see that in the data. In 2024, of the 53,000 people that were granted asylum, 20,600 were dependents who joined via the family reunification scheme, making up about 36 to 39% of refugees in that period of time. And like, last thing I just want to say on this, right? For all this conversation around the boats, right? The fucking boats, 82% of illegal immigrants in this country, which is the vast majority, did not come on boats. They came here legally on work visas and overstayed them. And why did they overstay their visa? Because of expensive, restrictive anti-immigration policies. They probably got to a point where they needed to renew their visa, couldn't afford it, but didn't want to go back and lose their, job and their life that they built here. And so they just didn't. And it's this whole thing, this topic is so important because it's about the whole criminality of it. The people overstaying their visas, they are breaking the law. And it's this criminality that bolsters this old myth that migrants bring crime. And it is an important conversation. Do migrants increase crime?
What's your advice on dealing with the small boats crisis in this country?
What is it?
The small boat
It's about the boats coming over the channel, so we're taking a lot of action to stop people coming over the channel who shouldn't be here, stopping them coming in the first place.
Well, look, immigration is a big factor.
Part of the problem with this whole muddying of terms, confusing illegal immigrants with legal immigrants and refugees, is that it means that people often tar all of them with the same brush, where they don't all act and behave the same way. Legal migrants, people who came here on work visas, etc., are statistically less likely to commit crimes than natives. This has been shown in endless data all around the world, and it's obvious they don't want to get kicked out of the country. UK studies have shown similar or slightly lower levels of criminality than natives. And I mean, you just have to think, we've seen so much immigration in the last 30 years, but crime rates have come down significantly since the 90s when it all started. But when that first generation of migrants has kids, the second generation, they tend to show more similar rates of crime as the native population. They become literally more assimilated. We see this with their cultural attitudes, their beliefs and behaviors. They become more like the general British population. However, there is a case of a thing called negative assimilation. This is a minority of second-gen immigrants who perhaps, don't get on very well in school. Maybe they struggle, maybe they have some learning difficulties, and there is evidence that that minority of second-gen immigrants are more likely to commit crimes, more likely to join gangs, and even more likely to join extremist groups. There's been a lot of research into this, and largely it comes down to this sort of social alienation. Often these second-gen immigrants can feel discriminated by mainstream society, and they develop a feeling of being neither British nor, wherever they came from. These ones who are falling behind, say academically or career-wise, they can feel like they don't really belong anywhere. And because many migrant groups tend to migrate into poorer parts of Britain, these people who may just have, difficulties like anyone else would, they are also in poorer communities that have less resources to help them. Now, there could be things you could do to help this. You could offer more support. Perhaps don't allow areas to become run down and criminal. Perhaps ensure employment, invest into people, but you can't do that because that is woke communism and that is bad. So that's legal immigrants, and then that's second generation immigrants. The third would be refugees. And if you look at it, the general trend will be the quicker that you can get refugees into work and bring their family over, their crime rates tend to be similar or lower than natives. However, if, like we do in Britain, you put them in a hotel for 2 years in limbo waiting for their case to be reviewed, it has been shown, in EU data at least, that in that second year there is an increase in criminality. It's not massive, but it does exist. And you do always have to take this data with a pinch of salt. It has been shown in Britain that people are more likely to report a crime if the perpetrator is brown or black. So obviously that can skew data. But it's not unreasonable to believe that if you force men to live in a hotel full of other men for 2 fucking years without the ability to work, and they have to live off of £49 a week, it's not far-fetched to say that some of them might start nicking some shit or selling some drugs. Like, it's not unreasonable. But look, all this nuance, right? It doesn't really fucking matter, because it's this fear of like migrant waves of crime that gives political justification to cart out some politician every 4 or 5 years who comes in and in all their wisdom introduces a load of policies to restrict immigration that instantly backfire, instantly increase the rate of permanent migrants in the country, and in turn create a black market for refugees to be snuck in over boats or in the back of lorries. Good job, lads. Well done. Really smart.
Got a problem, which is that there are people who want to come from around the world to this country because obviously it's a great place to be, and there's no doubt that it would be helpful if we could work with our French friends to stop them getting over the channel.
So with all that being said, where does that leave us? What can we take away from this? And I want to end this with just a bit of a reality check that I'm not going to sugarcoat it. If you have large waves of immigration, there is going to be some social issues. Groups sometimes will have friction. They might not get along. People might not like the rate of change. They might find it's overwhelming. Integration of immigrant groups takes time and it takes effort. Immigrant areas will look, feel, and sound very different to what you might be used to. However, and you have to remember this, we have to zoom out when we think about these issues. As is the case with every other wave of immigration in the past, after a few generations, the immigrants of today become British people of tomorrow. In the same way that the Caribbeans, the Irish, the Polish were all once looked as outsiders, as like unassimilated and backward and different. Now they are just a part of us. The same will happen with this current immigration. It will just take time and effort. And I have massive sympathy for these poorer communities when they get lots of waves of immigration. I didn't really touch on this, but refugee housing is run by private companies in the UK who, in order to make profit, house them in the poorest parts of Britain. Communities that have been underinvested in and are already struggling. And those locals might feel annoyed. They might feel like there's now more competition for housing. They might see that their hospitals are already struggling, that their schools are overcrowded. But you have to remember, it is not the refugee, it is not the migrant's fault that your hospitals are underfunded. It's not their fault that the government didn't build housing despite every single consecutive government promising to build housing. But we have to think about, how do we fix this?
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
So there it is. The UK has left the European Union.
The cost of the UK leaving the EU is estimated to have cost us about 4% of our GDP. That is equal to 100 billion a year. We are £1,500 per person poorer per year right now than we would be if we were still in the EU. That's a lot of money, right? That's our entire educational budget, or twice our annual defense budget. In America, they plan to spend 180 billion on securing the border. Australia have been spending billions. The EU alone has allocated 34 or so billion to protecting its borders. And I would just ask you, right, that cost, that amount of money that has been spent, has it bettered your nation? Has your country felt like it's improved? Could that money that has been spent on keeping people out, would it have been better if it was spent on, say, housing or the NHS? Things that might have actually benefited your life. On paper, immigration is good for the economy. And right now, it seems to be our solution to an aging population, the labour shortages and skill gaps. But let's be honest, immigration is not a silver bullet. The issue, the deep underlying issue, is that our system seems to require a permanent exploitable underclass in order to function. If the 37% of doctors, or 25% of care workers, or 10% of builders in this country who are immigrants went home tomorrow, the country would collapse. Your life will get considerably worse. And even if they all leave and there's this belief that all the native workers will flood in and take these jobs, even then, wages will not rise. Big businesses would focus more on automation, moving jobs offshore, or if they couldn't do any of that, they would just quietly lobby the government to just quietly bring a few more immigrants back in just for our industry. And let's even pretend you get someone who says no, right? Some politician that comes along and says, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to do the whole no migrant thing. And if you had a politician that refused to do that, I can guarantee you what their solution will be to gut the entire welfare state. No social housing, no NHS, no disability benefits, no out of work benefits. What they will do is get rid of all of that to make life so miserable that you are forced to take these terrible jobs that pay you dog shit. That is the logical conclusion of this whole anti-immigration thing. It's the only way it can work in the current economic structure.
Good evening. Well, the Work and Pension Secretary Mel Stride has said today we've got to do something about the number of people claiming out of work benefits. You know, if you're told you're too unwell to work and you're signed off by the GP, well, in many cases, that leads to negative thoughts. It leads to you thinking, somehow, I'm a victim.
So yeah, in some ways, you could say immigration is destroying the West, but it's not because of migrants or immigration. Immigration is just a natural process that will always happen. It's because the elites right now are using it as a distraction. They are pulling apart society to make us lose our minds about immigrants, all whilst they try and tear down everything that our grandparents fought for. Workers' rights, public services, community, and dignity. I don't know, that sounds pretty peak, right? But it doesn't have to be this way. We can use this sentiment as an argument to stop exploitative working conditions, to bring about stronger unions, to repeal the anti-union laws, to increase wages and give people more rights, not less. If every single worker in this country, whether they're natives or whether they're migrants, if they all had the exact same worker protections, the same pay, the same access to the welfare state, you will see, and I guarantee it, fewer people working in these exploitative conditions, getting paid shit. But the people in charge, the people in the media, they don't want that. Because if we start talking like that, then you might realize it was never about the people in the boats. It was always about the bosses in the boardroom. If you enjoyed that video, be sure to support me on Patreon. It massively helps what we're doing here. Like the video, subscribe to the channel. I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.